The jailing of 3 al-Jazeera journalists in Egypt has led to international outcry and focused attention on the role of and freedoms enjoyed by media in the Arab Middle East. Joining us now for more on that role in Beirut, Lebanon via Skype, here's Rami Khouri. He is a columnist at the Beirut-based Daily Star newspaper and director of the Issam Fares Institute at the American University of Beirut. And Rami, it's good to have you on our television network one more time. Can you explain exactly what these journalists are alleged to have done?
Well, nobody's really quite sure, actually, because the charges are so outrageous and so imprecise, and the evidence that has been presented in the Egyptian courts is a laughingstock. There's no real evidence. They just showed videos of them in their hotel room doing what TV journalists do. They had editing machines and cameras and cheeseburgers and things like that. And the charges are simply that they're part of a terrorist plot with the Muslim Brotherhood to destabilize Egypt. And the whole thing is completely outrageous. Everybody knows it, except possibly for the judge who's presiding at the trial. But the problem is that this is part of a hysterical moment in Egypt when mass hysteria is really reigning rather than rational thinking. And these 3 Al Jazeera English journalists were the most, got the most publicity. But the real trouble is that there's tens of thousands of Egyptians who are jailed, including hundreds of civil society activists and think tank people and NGOs, civil society. So the media is the cutting edge of this because the government in Egypt and most other Arab countries wants to prevent the free flow of information so that their ideas can dominate.
Do we assume, since the evidence clearly didn't lead to a guilty verdict, that somebody in a high position of authority told the judge, this is what you have to do?
Well, the way these systems work in autocratic countries like Egypt and most of the Arab world and many third world countries is that the people who run the daily operations of the government, the judges, the prosecutors, the policemen, the civil servants, media people and state-controlled media, they don't necessarily need written instructions to do stuff like this. They just follow the cue that they get from the leadership, and the great leader, in this case, it's the new president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, former commander of the armed forces. And while the government is cracking down on Muslim brotherhoods, independent media, foreign media, civil society activists, when the government's doing that, then the judges and the government officials and everybody else follows the same cue.
Let me get you, I think you know Neil MacDonald from CBC Television, and he put this out the other day, and I want you to react to it. He said, in reality, of course, the 3 journalists are going to prison for being employees of the Al Jazeera TV network, which is owned by the government of Qatar, which generally supported the elected Brotherhood government, and which the Egyptian generals, along with many other Middle Eastern despots, utterly despise. Do you see the verdict as somehow a shot across the bow at Qatar?
Partly, yes. It's Qatar and Jazeera, but also anybody who has a different perspective than the government of Egypt. So it includes leftists and nationalists and progressives and democracy activists and human rights NGOs and civil society people. Anybody who has an independent streak of thinking, and of course anybody who is thought to be supporting or in cahoots with the Muslim Brotherhood. And Qatar is very much seen in that frame by many people. Jazeera and Qatar are thought to be friendly to the Muslim Brotherhood. The great irony is that Arabic Jazeera is, to some extent, clearly closer to the Brotherhood than it is to the other side, but the English Jazeera is completely different. It's nothing like Jazeera Arabic. It's a completely different station with very little ideological perspectives at all.
Well, let's put this into some kind of historical perspective then. If we go back 20 years, how would you characterize the state of the news media and its editorial independence or not in the Arab world a couple of decades ago?
A couple of decades ago was pretty bad, generally speaking. You had periods of liberalization, like in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. You had 3-4 years of liberalization. There were elections all over the place. Press freedoms were increased. Hundreds of newspapers and magazines were started. The websites started to open up the system. And then it went on like that for about a decade or so. And then things clamped down again. And now we're going through a period after the uprisings and the revolutions where governments are trying increasingly to control as much media as they can, even trying desperately to try to control digitized media on the web and social media, which is really hard to do. So this is a period now when governments, broadly speaking, in the Arab world, with only a couple of exceptions, the governments are trying to prevent the flow of independent-minded thinking, any kind of action that can be seen as holding the government accountable for its actions. And they're doing outrageous things in some countries in the Gulf, particularly like Kuwait and Bahrain and other places. They're putting people in jail for 3 or 4 years for a tweet that they think is critical of the leader, the emir or the king of the country, or harmful to national dignity. I mean, these ridiculous phrases that mean whatever they want you to mean. So, somebody can make a very innocuous, mild criticism of the government's tax policy or something, and the judge will say this is hurting national dignity and security and put him in jail for 3 years for a tweet or a Facebook post or something like that. But this is what we're witnessing now in some of the Arab countries, and other countries like Jordan and others are trying to control the social media by forcing people to license and register their sites and things like that. So this is a difficult period for the media, broadly speaking, while ironically or paradoxically at the same time, there's so much more opportunity using the digital media, satellite media, offshore media, to produce a lot more free information and disseminate it. But you can't do that in a context of being politically active inside these countries.
Well, let me ask you, personally, you are known and have been known, have a good reputation for being an independent voice in the region. Do you feel a particular chill nowadays, given what's going on?
A little bit, yes. I mean, everybody does. It's a little bit easier in English than in Arabic. I work predominantly in English. I live in Beirut, which is a much more open society. I mean, it's the only place where I can live comfortably in the Arab world. That's why I live here, because you do have enough freedoms and openness to write and speak and read what you want and go to theater and listen to music and dress as you like. Though that's what makes Lebanon and Beirut so different from the rest of the region. But absolutely, I think everybody feels it, and you feel it in different ways and in different publications. In some newspapers or magazines or radio stations, you will get hints from the editors, don't criticize the Saudis, don't criticize the Qataris, take it easy on the Americans. For various reasons, people will have different positions. The trouble fundamentally is that every single media outlet in the Middle East, every single one of them is owned by some political personality or some group that is linked to a political party or to a political leadership in a country. There is really very little truly independent media, because truly independent media cannot exist financially. Somebody has to back it.
Let me get you to weigh in on what you perceive to be the power of social media. We know, of course, during the Arab awakening or the Arab Spring, however you'd like to refer to it, there were many people saying this would not have happened without the power of social media and its ability to get the message out to huge numbers of people in a relatively short space of time. Do you think that power has been overstated?
Generally, yes. I think it has been overstated by international analysts and observers, but there is a reality that at certain critical moments in Tunisia and Egypt in particular, in the early days of the uprisings, that the social media played a very important role for a brief period of time. It allowed the demonstrators to express themselves, get the message out about police brutality in rural Tunisia, for instance, which started the uprising. And there were moments when the demonstrators had no other outlet to express their views, and they used the social media, and partly to mobilize a little bit. But I explain it as the social media is important, but it's important like Paul Revere's horse was important for the American Revolution. It was a means of communicating. So Paul Revere's horse is really important, but Paul Revere was the brave guy who went and did his thing and helped bring the revolution to fruition. And the social media is important, but it's the men and women and people behind it in the Arab world, the brave people who use it, who really are the story. And when the social media was cut off in Egypt and Tunis and other places, when the government shut down the internet and the cell phone system, the next day there were more people out in the streets demonstrating, because the real social media is word of mouth. and community groups. You go to a mosque, you go to a church, you go to a grocery store, you go to a barber shop, and the word gets out in that neighborhood. In 15 minutes, 50,000 people will know what you want to tell them, and they will mobilize for a demonstration that evening. And that's the real social media, the person-to-person contact among people who trust each other and know each other.
I want to share with our viewers something that you wrote 8 years ago now, and then get you to comment on it today. A journalist, you wrote, can choose to work courageously in the Middle East in several different ways, given the many dangers that define the news business in this region, including dangers from active wars, guerrilla and militia groups, state violence, terrorism, foreign military occupations and armies, political intimidation, and the power of mass public opinion. While there is heroism in working in the face of all these threats, my 35 years of experience lead me to believe that the greatest form of courage that a journalist can display in his or her work is to affirm universal standards of human rights and dignity by confronting and challenging the power of the government and its security services. 8 years later, how well do you think media in the region do that?
I think some media do that really well, but most media don't, because most media are linked to or controlled by or beholden to organizations, institutions, or individuals that fund them, that make their work possible. And the majority of media in the Arab world, whether it's print or electronic or satellite, somehow are linked into this power structure, this prevailing power structure, which has all kinds of varieties of right and left and center, etc., and mostly right. But most people don't have the freedom to really challenge their governments and the power structure, especially the security services. I wrote that years ago because I'm absolutely convinced that the single greatest bad thing that has happened to the modern Arab world, the reason we are today in such a mess, is the decades and decades of military rule of Arab governments. And we're just seeing it reinstated in Egypt, which is a terrible tragedy. But it won't last because the people won't put up with it for very long. But challenging security services and military rule of entire countries, especially when individual families run those countries, like Saddam Hussein or Abdulaziz Bouteflika or Zain al-Abidin bin Ali or Hosni Mubarak, you name the names, and all over the Arab world you have families that you talk about rather than countries. Challenging them is very difficult when they control the guns, they control the money, they control the licensing, and that's why the media simply doesn't have the opportunities to do what a media can do in a free media environment, a pluralistic free media environment. But there's a lot of brave people out there doing courageous writing, especially now with the internet and blogging and things like that. You have outlets that allow people to express themselves, but the difficulty is those outlets in the cyberspace, in the blogosphere and all that, they're not linked to mobilizing masses of people on the ground. And that's the critical link that has to happen for real political change to happen. That's why the revolution succeeded in late 2010, early 2011. The digital media, the traditional satellite media, and the activists on the street all could work together, and they succeeded. That's much more difficult today because governments are preventing any serious media activism from hooking up with physical groups of people in society.
Now that's interesting. In our last minute here, just tell me this. I mean, earlier in the interview, I would have said you sound a bit optimistic that things are going to change and there will be increased editorial independence and freedom going forward. Having listened to your last answer, I'm not sure you are that optimistic. Straighten me out here. Which is it?
I don't think that there's going to be huge differences in media freedoms in the years ahead. My guess is that what you're going to see is continued pressure within Arab countries from journalists and others within society, and some pressure from overseas. But that's not going to really have a huge impact, I don't think. There will be some countries where things will be different. Tunisia now we expect will be different. Yemen and Libya perhaps, and Egypt if they continue to evolve in a good way, but we have to see where they go. But in most of the region, the press is seen as an important control mechanism by the ruling power elites, and therefore they often have the money to be able to control it. Therefore, I don't expect significant changes in the condition of the press. The press has to be seen as a symptom of the wider political culture that we live in, which is autocratic, non-democratic, individualistic, and paternalistic, and patriarchal. And that changes very, very slowly. But as that political culture changes, hopefully you'll get more press freedoms, more human rights freedoms, more gender equality, and a lot of other good things.
I think I should, at this point, just say, inshallah. Rami, it's always good of you to join us on TVO. Thanks for sparing so much time for us from Beirut, Lebanon tonight. Take care.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.